could not pay fines and fees. Again, when you place a burden on a family, and we're talking about the separations of families, and in particular parents from their kids, that's a hard decision to make. And most of us, I think, if we could afford it and it was based on fines and fees, we will pay the fines and fees. But structural, we know that when you put this type of burden on poor families, the outcome is not going to be favorable to them, right? It's always favorable to a structural system or those who are engaged in it, right? And it doesn't give us outcomes that we're looking for, because what we're looking for is trying to transform, again, structural systems to understand the negative impact and the historical content of what they have done in the past. It doesn't help these families. And it's not a public safety matter, because we use that a lot around, why we are doing this and why we put these burdens on families. But it just becomes more and more complicated. We have families that had endured fines and fees, and one particular family was making a decision whether or not she should pay the fines and fees. And she initially was paying the fine. And as they escalated, she found herself, her bills and her necessities being declined because of the fear of her son being incarcerated because of these limited amount of resources that she's available to pay. And crossing the aisles, we had one legislator add a sunshine clause to the legislation. Was this motivated by race? I have a belief that policies and laws have never protected Black and brown people. So how do we integrate those kind of thoughts when you have one legislator that doesn't really have a reason why he's putting a clause, but just seem like it is necessary to put a clause to ensure that the state won't lose any money in the next 5 years from these fines being eliminated. And one of the things we're doing, again, when we talk about policies and laws, there's always the implementation and the reality of what they bring. And what we're going to do over the next 2 years, the hope is to track the amount of money that the state is losing per se, the salaries and what they collect, and then try to go back to legislation and totally eliminate it without these particular clauses. So to answer you that question, I think the systemic system is always motivated by race. It has a historical content that integrates in a way that is structural, from slavery to convict leasing to the predator to a number of examples that we have seen today that causes these effects. I always use the example, in particular here in New Orleans, in particular when I go to the courtroom, it's very devastating and kind of weird, right? That we don't see no other people of any other color, right? We only see Black families. And I often wonder, when I go to the mall or I go to any outdoor place where I see children flourishing and laughing, and there's diversity among them, why is it only at the juvenile court system that I only see Black kids? And it's not that I'm advocating for any other kid to get arrested, but I think there's a sense of urgency. I think it's alarming when we see these type of things, that race plays a factor in it, right? That it's integrated in a way, if we don't put on the lens of humanity and look at it from a more internal justice being, then we will say some of this is normal, right? This is a practice that is normal. But when you look at the historical content of what has happened to us as a people, and I'm talking about brown and Black people, then you will find that there are disparities, and then understanding that not only just in the juvenile justice system, but there are disparities across the board for Black people that is affecting their daily lives, and not to add another burden of, this sort of slavery mentality or incarceration in a way that harms them economically, right? Because we all know that it's a driving force in our quality of life if economically we at a disadvantage. So I'll just leave it there. Again, I want to thank folks who hung around. I'm open to some questions, and again, I will say that this wouldn't have been possible without the holistic approach and the partners that we have, because we will be able to give a unified message throughout the state and to cross the aisle and to have conversation with legislators that we normally didn't. And it wasn't us, right? We had conversation with a lot of community members, but it was our partners that were able to talk to other folks and have conversations that we normally wouldn't have had, right? So I think looking at this, when we look at this, we look at it from a holistic approach. And sometimes to get things done, I think you have to be more innovative and think more critical and be more intentional about what you're trying to do, and set some of our bias and egos to the side to ensure that we're doing what's best, in particular for the families and their kids. Thank you for hanging around.
Okay, so it's open for questions. Any questions anybody wants to ask, you can put them in the chat box, and either for Ernest or for me, please go for it.
All right, we have one question in the chat that's asking if it was difficult to gather the data for the fourth bullet point, which is about the costs to collecting fees and fines being more than what was brought in. If it was difficult to gather that data, and maybe if you could just talk a little bit about what your process was for gathering that data.
Yes. So we, as partners, we had the University of California at Berkeley as the policy legal, and they were able to do public record requests. And I will say that we worked on this approximately 2 years prior to having this legislation passed, considering that the pandemic kind of slowed it up at some point, but it wasn't really difficult. And we had one other, I'd be remiss if I wouldn't say that, the Office of Juvenile Justice for the state of Louisiana, which is the overall arcing juvenile facilitator. They were open to and allowing us to get some of the data and access to some of it because they were the biggest collector. So when we were able to get them to release the data and to be supportive in a way that say, if we weren't collecting fines and fees, it won't hurt our operation. I think that's when folks went to buying in more and more. We have some rural parishes that we will have to dig in a little deeper. But again, this is was one of the biggest collecting agencies in the state. And they were on board of saying, if we weren't getting the fines and fees, then we can move forward without it. So I think, again, just overall having that collective voice and getting people from across the aisle to buy in is very vital. And doing some of the research and having someone outside of yourself and kind of, again, having this holistic approach gives you enough leverage to not burn yourself out and really get the work done in an adequate way.
Are there any other questions? Please speak up. Just put
We have one other participant, Jessica, who's raised their hand to ask a question. So Jessica, I'm going to take you off mute and you can pose your question to the panelists. Okay, I'm not sure if Jessica still has their question. Jessica, feel free to chime in, or you can ask your question in the chat if you'd like.
Are there any other hands up, Luke?
Nope, no other questions right now.
Okay. Well, again, everybody, we apologize. Oh, there's the question. Oh, by accident.
Okay, no problem. Thank you.
Again, we want to apologize for the technical difficulties. Those were unexpected and definitely threw us for a loop. But we were able to still finish our presentation and still have some time for questions. So thank you very much for attending, and please reach out to us if you have more questions or want to connect about going forward in doing this work in other states, because the campaign is really moving forward. Okay, so I think on behalf of Ernest and Luke, I'm going to say thank you very much. Appreciate your attendance, and we're going to I think we're going to leave it there.